All right, so here's a tutorial for how I made my sister this super cute coffee table. The first thing I did was figure out how big I wanted this coffee table to be. Initially, I cut it out to be 33 inches in diameter, and then the final dimensions ended up being 32.5 inches in diameter after I went back and I did the finished cut. So after I cut it out, I sanded it smooth and I applied 2 coats of paint. I chose this color called Pale Oak, which is kind of like a beigey white color. And I chose this color because I knew that you were going to see it through the table and it wasn't going to be completely covered up. And I wanted to pick a color that would look into my sister's space, and this ended up just being the color that I chose. So you really could pick any color you want. It doesn't really matter. Just pick something that you like and something that you think would look good in your space. So anyways, so then I went in and I started applying all of these wood discs. These actually came from logs that my sister brought back from Utah. She is a van person. She drives around all the time and she goes all over the country and she goes to a bunch of different national and state parks. And so she brought these back from Utah. So these are from an aspen tree and she was so excited to give them to me. So they've just been sitting in my house for a year, just drying out. And I knew I wanted to make something for her. And so ultimately, this is what I ended up going with. So I cut all these down to 1/8 of an inch in thickness because when I applied the epoxy, I didn't want to have to apply tons and tons of epoxy, make the table super heavy. And this seemed to be a good size. So I glued these down so that when I apply the first layer of epoxy, they won't float all over the place. And then after I applied these, I went in with a bunch of dried leaves and flowers that I got from Amazon. And I just, again, placed them where I thought they looked nice. There wasn't really a rhyme or a reason to it. And then after this is when I applied my first layer of epoxy. So when you're applying epoxy, you want to make sure that you're creating a dam around wherever you're pouring. So I put a very thick tape around this tabletop and then I caulked from underneath. And I poured this first layer and then I just used a heat gun to pop any air bubbles. And now I'm applying more leaves and flowers on top because I want to give some dimension to this table. And hopefully you'll see this when, yeah, here we go. So you can kind of see, hopefully, that there's a little bit of dimension and layering. And I just thought this looked really nice for this particular table. Ultimately, I ended up doing 3 coats for this table, and I thought that worked really well for what I wanted to achieve. Okay, so here's my second layer of epoxy. I waited 6 hours as per the instructions. And this is going all over the second layer of flowers that I put down. And after 24 hours, this is what I ended up with. So I went back in and I did a rough cut of my final dimensions, which again were 32.5 inches. And then I went in with 220 grit sandpaper and I just sanded everything down smooth. Especially the top, I wanted to make sure to get any rough areas dealt with, or if there were any little things that fell into the epoxy, I wanted to make sure to sand it down so that you wouldn't see that when we get to the final coat. And then after I sanded this entire thing smooth, I went in with mineral spirits and then I went in with a couple rounds of just regular water and I just wiped everything down to make sure there was absolutely no dust for my final epoxy pour. And then before I did my final coat of epoxy, I ended up adding edge banding to this just to make the table appear a little bit thicker. So I used tiger maple for this and I let it soak in water for about 3 hours so that when I applied it around the edge of the table, that it would bend a little more easily. And I ended up using this really great product called, I think it's called like Thix. Oh, I'll link it below, but it's by Total Boat and I've had a lot of success with their products. And it's an epoxy adhesive. So I used a combination of this epoxy adhesive along with screws. I definitely could have gotten away with just using the epoxy adhesive. However, I was in a time crunch, so I didn't want to have to let it sit overnight with just the clamps. So I ended up just screwing it in and I made sure to countersink the screws so that I can go back in and just add little plugs to hide the fact that the screws are there. So again, I'm just going around, I'm just adding screws around the entire table. And I'm just kind of using the clamps to help hold it as I'm going through and adding all the screws. And as well as the plugs that I ended up using for this, I also used a little bit of wood filler just to help hide those seams around the entire table. Okay, and here's me. Now I'm going back in and I'm adding those little plugs. So again, I'm using the epoxy adhesive. And then I just cut these little plugs from a dowel that match the same exact size. as the bit that I used. I think it was 3/8 of an inch. But again, just going through, pushing those in, and I also just use a mallet to tap them in. And then after I went around this table and I added all of these little plugs, ultimately I just let this entire thing sit overnight for 24 hours because I wanted to make sure that all of the plugs were super secure. It does say that it sets up after about 3 hours, but I just wanted to be super certain that there weren't going to be any issues. And then the next day I came back and I sanded everything smooth and I made sure that I got any of the resin residue off of the wood because when I stained this, I didn't want there to be any blotchiness of where there was any like leftover resin. So I just really took my time on this and I went around and I sanded around the whole thing. And then I went back in and I just got any areas on the top I noticed. Again, wiped it all down before this final step. So this is kind of a skim coat of the epoxy resin. Again, I just wanted to add another coat just to kind of go over everything and smooth everything out. This is kind of like the top coat, if you will. And I use a glove for this final step because I wanted to make sure that all of the epoxy is going right to the very edge. I always feel like this is an area where people struggle the most, is getting the epoxy all the way to the edge, because I feel like once it cures, you can definitely notice if you didn't get like full coverage on it and it ends up not looking so great. So I really just went around and I took my time making sure that I brought everything to the edge. Again, using my heat gun to pop any of the bubbles that I saw, and also just to make the epoxy a little more viscous and just to make it so that it would flow a little bit more easily all the way to the edge. Again, really taking my time. I would say this was probably like my longest epoxy step, just because I was being so like particular about it to make sure that it looked perfect. And also, this is a time where you could decide if you want to leave it a high gloss. It's not my personal choice. However, I know a lot of people do like a high gloss look. So at this point, you could leave the top completely like just as it is. But ultimately, again, this wasn't on camera, but I did end up using a very high grit just to sand it down, just to give it more of a satin look. Again, I didn't post this particular part. However, I would be happy to make a video for you guys if you're interested in seeing that. Okay, so now this is where I'm going to apply the gel stain. I also just went ahead and I applied or attached some legs that I thought looked nice. I was going to initially build legs, but I just honestly ran out of time. So I just attached some legs that I liked, and then I went through and I applied two different stains. I applied a coffee stain, and then I went over top with a hickory stain just to add a little more warmth. And I'm being very careful as I'm applying the stain because I did find out that epoxy does stain. So you just want to be very careful and very intentional with how you're applying the stain to make sure that you don't run into any issues. All right, so now the stain is dry and now it is time to buff out the top. So again, like I said, I did go for a satin finish. So there is a slight haziness that I need to deal with. So I'm using some hard wax. And the first step for the hard wax is just applying it. And I really like these foam pads that I got on Amazon. Again, I'll link everything below. So all I do with hard wax is I go in and I just apply it all over the surface. I'm not being super particular with how I'm applying it. I'm just making sure that it gets on the entire surface. And I'm also making sure to not go in straight lines, because I found that when you go in straight lines, you can kind of like notice the lines once you're finished. So kind of by going just in this random pattern, it seems to work the best. So I apply this again with this foam pad, and then I let this sit for about 30 minutes before I go back in with just a clean lint-free cloth, and I just buff the whole thing out. Sometimes I'll do it by hand, or sometimes I'll come back in with a clean foam pad and I'll buff it out with that. But hopefully you can kind of see how by using this product that it takes that haziness away and lets you see the items underneath a little bit better. Alright, so this is what it looks like after all of the wax is applied. Again, letting this sit for 30 minutes before I go back in and I buff it out using a clean lint-free cloth. And then this is my very final step. I go in with Howard Feed and Wax and I just apply it all over. I apply it on the sides and I apply it on the top, and then I come back in again after letting it sit for about 20-30 minutes and I wipe everything down with, again, just a lint-free cloth, making sure that I get off any excess. So here's the finished look. I hope you enjoyed watching. Comment below if you have any questions. Thanks, bye.